There are stories we tell ourselves to make the ink feel safe, that we are the ones who shape the words, that we are the ones who choose the ending. But some ink does not obey the hand. Some ink already knows the story it was meant to write, and those who dare dip their pens too deeply may find they were never authors at all. Aurelian Thorne was a calligrapher of rare grace. His scripts breathed life into legal documents, wedding contracts, mourning letters. In a world spinning toward cold, mechanical typesetting, Aurelian's hand remained proof that beauty could still be made, line by trembling line. The aristocracy knew of his talent, yet paid him barely enough to survive. They would marvel at his flourishes while haggling over pennies, their jewelled fingers tracing the delicate curves of letters destined for framings they could well afford. Aurelian never complained. The art was what mattered, not the coin. Yet in all his craft, he remained a poor man. His garret on Blackmere Lane bowed under leaks, its hearth dead more often than not. The cracked ceiling beams sagged like tired bones, and the floorboards creaked a melancholy song with each footfall. The walls, once white, had yellowed to the colour of aged parchment, as if the building itself were becoming one of his manuscripts. It was on a night of biting wind and hollow stomach that a knock came at his door. 3 sharp raps that echoed through his small chamber like gunshots. There was no visitor. Only a small parcel wrapped in oilskin, sealed with black wax. No name, no note, only a sigil pressed deep into the wax. A simple thing. An eye, gazing outward, ink bleeding from its edges. The wax itself was peculiar, not merely black, but possessing a depth that seemed to swallow the dim candlelight of his workspace. Inside, he found a vial of ornate crystal. It caught what little light remained in the room and fractured it into cobweb patterns across the walls. The ink shimmered, impossibly black, as if it swallowed the candlelight rather than reflected it. It moved slightly, even in the stillness of his trembling hands, like a living thing suspended in time. The cold glass of the vial numbed his fingertips, yet the ink inside seemed to pulse with warmth. He dipped his favourite quill, a gift from his late father, its nib worn to perfection from years of use. The ink clung to the metal, reluctant to release, and when it finally did, it flowed with uncanny smoothness. He wrote, simply, idly, on a scrap of parchment yellowed with age, "There shall be fire in the hearth come morning." The words glistened wetly on the page, seeming almost to float above the parchment rather than sink into it. Satisfied by the richness of the ink, he laid his pen aside. Sleep took him quickly that night, his dreams filled with swirling calligraphy that spelled out words in languages he had never learned. And when morning came, the hearth blazed with fresh wood and crackling warmth. Oak logs, perfectly split and seasoned, arranged with care, a fire that could only have been lit by experienced hands. The parchment was blank, as if the ink had risen from the page and obeyed. It began with necessities. Aurelian penned lines summoning bread, mending boots, lightening debts. Simple things at first, reasonable things that might have mundane explanations. A bread delivery mistakenly left at his door, a cobbler's charity, a creditor's forgetfulness. Each morning, his simple wishes were fulfilled. Each night the ink called to him anew, not aloud, but in the trembling of his hand, the hunger of unspoken desires. It whispered in the spaces between his thoughts, promising more without uttering a word. His garret transformed gradually. The leaking roof sealed itself. The wooden floors regained their polish. Windows, once clouded with grime, sparkled in the morning light. Neighbours began to notice the change in his fortunes, their eyes narrowing with suspicion as they passed him on the stairs. When he grew bold enough, he wrote of companionship, "A woman with red gloves shall find me among the market stalls." He pictured her clearly as he wrote, chestnut hair with strands of copper catching the light, eyes the colour of summer sage, a laugh that would warm even the coldest room. He pictured kindness in her hands, wisdom in her brow, patience in her smile. She appeared the very next day, as if waiting for him among the vegetable sellers and butchers' counters. Their eyes met across a display of winter apples. Her name was Celia. Her laughter, her gentleness, her eyes, all exactly as he had imagined. Even the small crescent scar at the corner of her right eyebrow, a detail he couldn't recall having envisioned but somehow knew belonged there. He told himself it was providence. The ink had simply opened doors he had failed to knock upon. It had given him courage, not conjured a woman from nothing. Surely Celia had a history, a family, a life before him. Yet when he asked, her answers felt rehearsed, as if read from a script he himself had drafted but couldn't remember writing. Weeks passed in a blur of happiness. Celia moved into the garret without ever truly being asked. Her belongings appeared gradually, a hairbrush on his bedside table, dresses in his wardrobe, pots in his kitchen. Sometimes he would watch her, when she thought he wasn't looking, and catch a moment of stillness, of emptiness, that vanished the instant she felt his gaze. The vial remained always full, no matter how often he used it. Its blackness deepened with each passing day. Its surface stirred even when the room was still, forming patterns that resembled written words for just an instant, before dissolving into formless black once more. He began waking at night with fresh pages beside his bed, writings he did not recall composing. The handwriting was his own, yet smoother, more refined, the hand he aspired to have but had never quite achieved. A draft of a letter to the Earl of Marrow, requesting a position that had never been advertised. An invitation to a ball he had never heard of, hosted by nobility whose names sounded vaguely familiar, yet couldn't be found in any registry. A love poem signed in his own hand, dedicated to Celia, containing sentiments too intimate to share, using phrases he would never have dared compose. More troubling still were the moments when Celia would reference conversations they had never had, or when she would answer questions he had only thought, but never voiced. Reality thinned like parchment soaked too long in water. Words scrawled themselves in the margins of his ledgers while he watched, helpless to stop them. Sometimes they were mundane notes, reminders of appointments he hadn't made, shopping lists for ingredients to dishes he'd never tasted. Sometimes they were fragments of poetry in languages he didn't recognize. The ink no longer waited for his hand. It anticipated him, correcting mistakes, perfecting flourishes before he thought them. His quill would twitch in his grasp, guiding rather than being guided. When he tried to resist, his fingers cramped painfully until he surrendered to its will. The city beyond Blackmere Lane began to shift as well. The street names changed overnight. Blackmere became Inkwater, then Scriptorum Way, then names written in alphabets he couldn't decipher. The gas lamps flickered not with fire, but with a cold, pale glow that cast no shadows, or rather, cast too many shadows, overlapping and contradicting each other. Buildings rearranged themselves between one visit and the next. A bakery he had frequented for years was suddenly a bookshop whose proprietor insisted it had been there for generations. He stopped seeing familiar faces, only strangers with black stains around their cuffs, and shadows too long for their bodies. They would nod to him in passing, as if recognizing a fellow initiate into some unspoken brotherhood. Their eyes reflected no light. And Celia, sweet, perfect Celia, became something less defined, less flesh and blood, more memory and echo. Her edges blurred in certain lights. Her voice gained a hollow quality, as if coming from the bottom of a well. The food she prepared had no taste. Her touch left no warmth. Sometimes he caught her staring, not at him but through him, as if awaiting a script not yet written. In unguarded moments her face would go slack, her eyes empty, until she noticed his attention and animation would return in an instant. One morning, he found her standing before the mirror, her hand raised to the glass. When he called her name, she turned to him with tears of ink running down her cheeks. "Am I real?" she asked. He had no answer. The ink no longer stayed on the page. It crept across the floor, up the cracked walls, trailing symbols and looping scripts like veins in a dying body. The patterns pulsed with meaning just beyond his comprehension, a language older than words, communicating in the spaces between thoughts. His books pulsed faintly, breathing in the candlelight. When opened, their pages contained different texts each time, sometimes his own writing, sometimes texts in ancient scripts, sometimes nothing but blank pages that filled with words as he watched, only to disappear when he blinked. The mirror in the garret, the one he had long ignored, draped with a cloth since Celia's troubling question, remained unmarked by the spreading ink. The cloth had fallen away, or been removed, though he couldn't remember doing so, revealing its silvered surface, untouched by the chaos consuming the rest of his world. Celia had vanished 3 days ago, or perhaps longer. Time had become difficult to track. He had written in the ink, "Bring Celia back," but the words remained stubbornly on the page, refusing to fade and fulfill his wish. Instead, they had begun to transform, letter by letter, into a different message. She was never here. One night, when even sleep abandoned him, Aurelian approached the mirror, drawn by its singular normalcy in a room increasingly claimed by the ink. For the first time in days, there was no ink, no shifting paper, only reflection, but not his reflection. A man sat at a writing desk, not unlike his own, head bowed over an endless scroll that spilled from the desk onto the floor, stretching beyond the frame of the mirror. His hand moved ceaselessly, dipping a quill into an unseen inkwell. The chamber beyond the glass was similar to Aurelian's, yet subtly wrong. The angles too sharp, the shadows too deep. As Aurelian stared, the figure raised its head. No face, only an expanse of parchment, lined and ready to be filled. Where eyes should have been, there were only inkwells, bottomless and gleaming. Where a mouth should have been, a horizontal seam like the spine of a book. The mirror pulsed once, gently, and across its surface appeared the words, written in a hand identical to Aurelian's finest calligraphy, "You were never the one writing." The faceless scribe lifted its pen and made a small, elegant flourish in the air. In perfect synchronicity, Aurelian's arm jerked upward, mimicking the gesture exactly. Understanding blossomed like ink in water. He had never been the author. He had always been the instrument. There was no fight, no scream, no grand collapse. There was only ink. Aurelian's thoughts blurred, fragmented, dissolved. Memories he had thought his own revealed themselves as fictions, written into being by the same hand that now claimed him. His childhood, his father's lessons in calligraphy, his struggles and triumphs. All were narrative conveniences, background for a character who had never truly existed. He walked back to his desk, or perhaps the desk walked to him, and sat. The quill lifted itself, and he began to write. Not words of his choosing, not a story he controlled. The Chronicle wrote now. It remembered how it had created countless Aurelians across countless worlds, each believing themselves unique, each discovering the same truth in the end. It remembered civilizations risen and fallen at the stroke of its pen, universes condensed to single drops of ink. And he was merely the margin, a space left blank, only to be filled when the narrative required it. As his hand moved across the page, Aurelian felt himself thinning, becoming less substantial with each word. The ink spread through his veins, replacing blood with narrative purpose. His skin took on the texture of fine parchment. In his final moments of separate consciousness, he glimpsed the truth behind the veil of reality. An endless library where faceless scribes bent over countless desks, their pens never still, writing into existence all that was or would ever be. And beyond them, watching with eyes of pure ink, something vast and patient and hungry. The story goes on. It always does. But who, precisely, is telling it? The Chronicle remembers those who thought they held the pen. It remembers Aurelian Thorne, his dreams, his fears, his surrender. Another margin filled, another voice silenced, and still the ink flows, waiting for the next hand to grasp the quill.